Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our ESSEC Business Insights webinar, and thank you for being here with us today. My name is Ian Ong, and I'm the Alumni Relations Manager for ESSEC Asia Pacific. I would now like to introduce our speaker for today, who is Mr. Lee Kok Hao, Founder and Director of KeyHole Insights. He will be speaking on COVID-19's impact on Chinese business sentiments. Should you have any questions that you'd like to ask the speaker, please ask them via the chat group. We will try our best to answer them during the Q&A session. Without further ado, I shall now pass the mic over to Kok Hao.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Ian, and thank you, ESSEC, for giving me this opportunity to share with your esteemed alumni and friends of ESSEC. I think the topic we're going to present today is on the impact of COVID-19 on business implications in China. Before we do that, I'll quickly introduce a bit of myself, my company, what we do. So we are a market research and consultancy company. Hold on, I think the slide is not moving. Yeah. So I shall skip this very quickly. We are focusing on Asia, headquartered in Singapore. Companies are largely global home champions seeking to internationalize and transform their businesses. And the topic we have today is COVID-19 impact on Chinese businesses. And before I move further, I would like to quickly caveat that this particular presentation or this particular survey was conducted between around middle of March, between 10th of March, 11th of March. The survey was running, and by the time we get all the survey, it's only mid-March. So there have been some changes to the situation, and things have evolved. And to give you a better idea how this relates to the current situation, I also like to show you guys what has happened since then. So this is a FT tracker. You can actually find it on Financial Times, and they track it every day, and this is updated every day. So as you can see, the red line represents what has happened in 2020 with COVID, and the gray line actually happens on unusual what happens in the Chinese economy in a usual year in 2019, for example. So what happens? You usually so in January it is indexed to 100, and what usually happens is as it runs up to Chinese Lunar New Year, economic activity tapers off. And there's a period where people just go back to the hometown, and that's largely the same. But what happens is COVID happened on January 25th, the eve of the Lunar New Year. And what happens is with that, when economic activity recovers, usually after Chinese New Year, it stays down this time around. So the gap between what you see of the gray line and the red line actually represents what happened on the economic impact of COVID on the Chinese economy. And as you can see, the red line, the red dotted line that I have here actually represents when the survey was conducted. So at that point in time, I think things was pretty hazy, and the survey was conducted under such a scenario. So I want everyone to actually have that context in mind when we actually go through the presentation. Of course, first week of January, first week of April, what happens is Wuhan actually announced the lifting of the lockdown, and things have recovered significantly since then. Next, I'll go through some of the sub-indices because the impact of COVID actually is felt very differently across different sectors. So in terms of real estate, we can see that, again, the red line represents the time when the survey was taken. So during that period, things are actually starting to improve. I think Chinese has been very innovative in using technology to sell houses. So we can see some improvement following which, but still nothing compared to the usual recovery seen in 2019. But what happens is after COVID, we see actually in terms of real estate, it has largely closed the gap. And anecdotal evidence from China has shown that after COVID-19, people actually came out in force looking for a bigger house because with the lockdown, with working from home, home-based learning, I think a lot of people realize that, that the small house they have is no longer sufficient to house everyone and conducting economic activity. In terms of power plant consumption, in fact, right now, we are seeing power plant consumption even higher than what we normally see in 2019. As for container freight, I think there was a bit of recovery after this survey was taken, right up until the Wuhan lockdown was lifted. But I think situation globally and externally took a turn for the worse. And as you can see, this particular sector turned downwards very quickly. Next, in terms of traffic congestion, there was a huge disparity in terms of activity before this survey was taken, and after the survey was taken, it has since closed the gap. In fact, right now, you can see traffic congestion is actually back to normal levels. And in China, actually, economic activity, even F&B outlets are full of people. And just something interesting is that, in fact, Shanghai Disneyland sold out their tickets within minutes after the tickets were announced online, or rather, ticket sales was reopened online. They saw the first opening day ticket within minutes. Air pollution, it has came down since COVID-19. What is bad for human beings is actually pretty good for Mother Earth. So what happens is we've seen a huge drop, but then air pollution actually has came back up above 2019 level at this time of the year. And of course, box office sales, needless to say, has just stayed at zero ever since. So some of the industries are much more affected than the other. So with this backdrop, I'd like to come back to this survey again. So as you can see, the demographic of the survey is such. We have 1,000 people, 1,000 respondents for this survey. We sent out approximately close to 1,800, but there's only 1,000 respondents. This was done across 31 provinces. In terms of the breakdown by industry, we have 19% manufacturing, 17% electronics, 14% real estate. Very close to the Chinese economy composition or makeup. 61% are from manufacturing, IT, real estate, and trade and retail. 70% are enterprises. So within this group, there are a bit of state-owned enterprise, foreign enterprise, and central enterprise. 70% of all this are SMEs that has less than 500 people. And of which 50% of the companies have an annual revenue of less than 50 million RMB, and that translates to about 10 million Sing dollar, or about 6 to 7 million euro. Sentiment is most affected in services, trade, and retail. So as you can see, the survey respondents came back. What was on this particular question? What's the expected impact of COVID-19 on companies' 2020 revenue? The average is between 20+% across the board. Some industries are worse hit. For example, services industries. Close to half of them expect revenue to decrease between 20% and above. And for trade and retail, 30% expect the revenue to decrease by 20% and more. And when we actually tabulate the respondents by provinces or by geographic location, we notice that these 4 provinces are one of the worst hit: Xinjiang, Ningxia, Guangxi, and Hubei. In Xinjiang, one of the worst hit are the oil industries. Because of the lockdown, I think manufacturing was shut off completely, and as a result, one of the biggest end user for utilities are actually the manufacturing and the industrial complex. Tourism, particularly, was hit. In Ningxia, it's the coal industry, the chemical industry. Guangxi automobile, chemical and oil, and Hubei, of course, were the epicenter of the entire COVID-19 manufacturing, literally everything, F&B and wholesale. But at the same time, I think this also reflects some of the bigger sector in all these particular provinces. So with this 1,000 survey from key executive in all these industries and all these companies, we asked this question: how long can your company's cash flow sustain? And more than half of them says that the current cash flow can only sustain them for another 3 more months. And that was at the peak of the crisis. And fortunately, within 1 month, provinces in China, in Wuhan, and in everywhere, every part of China started to open up. And that's within 1 month. And thankfully, I think a lot of businesses actually don't have to really think about this particular scenario where the situation continues for more than 1 month. And back then, because situation globally hasn't been as bad in China, more than half of businesses with 40% or more of income coming from overseas indicated sufficient cash flow to actually last 6 months or longer. But I think right now the situation is pretty much reversed. Next, how then would company look at tiding over this cash flow squeeze? When we asked this question back in March, is that a lot of them actually would look at business loans, and thankfully the Chinese government came in with a lot of stimulus, with a lot more lending, lowering of interest rate, RRR cards, interest rate card, which has helped businesses from this aspect. The second biggest share of fund will be from funds from existing shareholder, and finally salary reduction. And the next will actually be delaying payments to their suppliers and vendors. Of about 8% would choose to do that. And when we actually break this particular question down by sectors, we see that actually in the real estate sector are more inclined than other sectors to delay payment to tide over cash flow. So if you look at the earlier slide, where in general average industries or average companies, only about 8% would delay payment. Real estate industries, this particular mode or option tends to be higher than the other. And when we look at manufacturing companies are more inclined to taking business loan, likely because of the nature of the business tends to be more long-term, tends to be compared to real estate, probably not as cash flow heavy. And then when we look at IT industry is more likely than other sectors to reduce headcount or to cut pay. And then next we move on with regards to overseas expansion. And results shows that companies that derive 20% of their revenue from overseas express the greatest interest in further overseas expansion. And Southeast Asia is actually the top choice. So when we polled this group of 1,002 key executives in China, Southeast Asia actually constitute 38% of their expansion inclination, followed by East Asia. And by East Asia, I am referring to countries such as Korea, Japan, followed by Europe, United States, and Middle East. When we actually break them down by sectors, it's slightly different as well. Trade and retail, definitely Southeast Asia is a big market with more than close to 1 billion population in Southeast Asia. IT and electronics, largely Southeast Asia as well. When we look at real estate, 38% Southeast Asia, because of the population, because of rising affluence, because of urbanization as well. manufacturing, largely Southeast Asia as well. So as we can see, Southeast Asia is one of the top choice in this particular survey, where we can poll across Chinese key executives. So in this particular question, it's slightly different. This is not about in terms of sales, but more in terms of regional headquarters or factories. Again, we see some of these sectors: manufacturing, IT, trade, real estate are on some of the top industries that are likely to move to Southeast Asia. So companies with 20% to 40% of revenue from overseas business express the most interest in expanding into other markets beyond China. This may change somewhat, but I would say that for Southeast Asia, the situation should likely be pretty much the same. The interest will likely be contained, simply because I think in terms of this particular episode, Southeast Asia so far has not been affected as badly as countries or regions such as Europe or the States. So I think with that, I'd like to actually point or bring your attention back to how the situation has evolved. If you look at this particular chart, in Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, the number of deaths actually sort of stabilized. In most part of the world, it has started to come down, but in US, it's still one of the highest. In particular, 1,344 in this period between May 13 to May 19. Europe has come down very quickly as well. So this is just a quick update using other indicators to see how things are changing. I think in London, we are seeing a bit of revival compared to, say, Paris or even New York. Some of the countries like Beijing, as you can see, we are seeing a lot more activities. The red line again showing this year, the gray line showing last year. So places like Singapore is about 50%, Tokyo is 60%. In Sydney, in Cape Town, it's also recovered somewhat. Yeah, so with this, I'd like to point out a few of my own personal opinion or observation. I think what we're seeing now is Southeast Asia would probably be one of the first few countries to start reopening borders. Already talks are in process with regards to how to facilitate air travels. We will definitely see a longer check-in timing, but countries are talking about how then we can restart air travel. For example, with measures such as health declaration, or people who want to travel may have to start doing a swab test and to get declared a clean bill of health. But I think definitely business travel, definitely travels are first gonna happen in this part of the world. So some of the things that may happen would definitely be more South-South trade. So trade within Southeast Asia is probably gonna start to recover first, follow on by trade in other parts of the world. And with this, I'm not sure how much time we have more, but I would like to open up the floor, I guess. I think there are some questions that are coming in already. So with that, I think Ian, let's open up the floor first. And if there is a need, I may show the second presentation I prepared. Yeah, over to you, Ian.
Okay, KeyHole, we have actually received some questions already. I'll start with a question on from myself as well. In your earlier presentation, you actually showed parts of China which were actually severely affected, such as like Xinjiang and Hubei. But how actually is your opinion about Beijing and Shanghai? What do you think is your opinion for these two cities?
So I think there's been pretty much a lot of report that's already come out, and I think the pictures are showing that people are actually mingling together already. And in fact, I'm in a number of group chats in China, and people actually are organizing activities, small groups, less than 20 people, but people are actually meeting up, coming together, of course, taking the necessary safety precautions such as wearing a mask. And I think restaurants, I believe, don't have very tight restrictions such as Hong Kong. I think in Hong Kong, what you have is every restaurant cannot have more than 10 people. But in Beijing, I don't think there is such enforcement. And literally, I think people are meeting, and the streets are busy already. But of course, there is also a air of somberness. People are taking it seriously. They are sanitizing their hand more frequently. They keep a certain safety distance. But I would say that in China, in large parts of China, except for provinces such as Harbin or where there have been some spikes recently or some new cases, the most part of China actually it's business as usual.
The next question that we have is, with your survey and post-survey, what are you seeing from hospitality and luxury and retail in China?
So I think in terms of hospitality and luxury, in fact, Hermes sort of had like a very big day or big week upon reopening. So I think there are definitely evidence of some revenge buying. A lot of Chinese customers, I mean, they've been home for 2 months or even more, and they can't wait to spend some money. But at the same time, I think there are nuances between all this spending. So for example, I take spending on cosmetics. If I'm not wrong, there have been reports, and I believe reports will continue to come out, such as lipstick sales actually dropping, dropping like a fly. Because with COVID-19, we are seeing people wearing more masks, people staying at home more frequently, and hence the less need for some of this cosmetics. So I would say that retail sales, luxury sales is really also a very sector specific. And in terms of hospitality, I think a lot of my friends actually are traveling already. And like I've mentioned, Shanghai Disneyland, within the first day of reopening of sales, it just gets snapped up and so on. But what happens is, I think there will be crowd controls, there will be less people. And in fact, that may be more desirable for some individuals, because I mean, if you've been to China in some holidays, in some places, it's basically super packed like sardine, where you just are squeezing to get in. And with this crowd control, I think the experience is slightly better, but definitely traveling is happening, but probably not at the normal kind of rate. So I have friends and classmates that actually have already started traveling from Shanghai to Hainandao, for example. Yeah.
The next question that we have is, how do you see COVID politics in the United States impacting business and business sentiment in China?
Okay, so the topic of this presentation is on China. So I am less inclined to talk more about US, but I think to the extent that COVID politics are affecting, for sure, I think one of the biggest concern is in terms of quality of medical equipment, in terms of safety. And I think the Chinese wants to be recognized across the world as one of the quality producers. So I think with a country as big as China, and with everybody rushing into the mass trade, there will no doubt be some black sheep among the crowd. And I think the Chinese government, more than anyone else, more than the Americans, more than the Europeans, wants to make sure that the products they send out are legit and are of decent qualities, so that news like what we've been seeing a few weeks back will not happen. So I think we are seeing Chinese themselves doing a lot of self-censorship, doing a lot of checks, audit checks to ensure that the medical equipments are of decent quality. So what happens is we are seeing also a lot of interesting behavior where people are parking mass sales or mass exports under other category. So what happens is, for example, in the past, mass tends to be under a certain ISIC code. People are now actually smuggling, not smuggling it, but declaring it under other categories to make sure that it goes through faster and that it will not be subjected to checks more easily. So to that extent, I think definitely exports affected. But let's face it, around the world, there can not be a producer that can produce in such volume and such quantity. So as the Chinese government starts to clear up the quality issue, I think slowly this would start to get better. Yeah.
The next question that we have is, many countries have started their economies with a good revenue in domestic demand, such as hospitality and air transportation. For an island country like ours, with a small domestic market, what do you think the businesses can do, as exports may be limited due to many countries closing up their customs due to COVID?
That's a very tough question. That's a very good question. I presume by ours, the person asking the question is referring to Singapore. I think for Singapore, we are a small open economy, unfortunately. And the thing is, if situation around the world does not improve, there's only a certain extent we can get better. So definitely our fortunes are tied to the global economy. Let's be very honest. The Singapore economy break up 20% are from manufacturing. And with manufacturing, a lot of export, a lot of the end destination goes to China. And even to China, it's probably intermediate destination that actually goes into reassembly into to US as well. So a lot of end demand for Singapore goods, which is largely in the electronic sector and the pharmaceutical sector, is actually in US, in Europe. So I would say that the only thing that probably we can move more into is into the new economy, into e-commerce, into digital services. But again, if the world economy is in the doldrum, there's very little we can actually outperform. Yeah, and not forgetting the fact that a large part of our economy is also tied to oil because of us being a refinery center. A large part of our economy is also tied to exports because imported wholesale trade is a big chunk of the Singapore economy as well.
Okay, here's the last question before we actually move to the second part of your presentation, KeyHole.
Yeah.
The question is, worst case scenario, let's say COVID-19 evolves into another virus called COVID-20 and countries go through another round of lockdown. What do you think businesses can do, especially for non-digital businesses such as construction?
Again, I think this is a difficult question, but I would say that what we are seeing here is a modern pandemic. I do believe that in the past there are actually other instances of such pandemic happening. Case in point, I think the flu in the US 1 or 2 years ago. But I think the whole the whole mindset about this particular pandemic is such whereby because of social media, it's even more prevalent than a few years ago. Because of a few other issues, because people's impression that this virus comes from China and anything that comes from China would be bad. So there is also this particular effect that's at play here. Then there is also the effect that I think China started something that is really unprecedented, which is a lockdown. And I would say that if this had happened, or the epicenter is not China, it's in US or in Europe, this may not have happened. And because this may not have happened, other countries and other cities may not necessarily follow suit. So as much as I would like to say that, I mean, we should take this seriously, but I think there is also at some point where fatigue takes place, and country realize that the reserve cannot go on forever to subsidize business, to pay out unemployment claims. We will come into a new normal where businesses will go about their businesses with a lot more added precaution. Yeah, but I think the simple answer to this thing is, I would say that if this continues for another month or two, people will start, economic activity in all likelihood will start resuming. It's just that there will be a lot of measures taking place which will increase business costs. There will be a lot of precaution. The level of economic activity will go back to maybe 70% or 60% of the usual level, but I think things will have to be opened up again. Yeah, that's my own take of this whole issue. Yep, Ian.
Okay, so Papa, we'll move on to your second part of your presentation.
Yeah, so the second presentation, I'll have to stop the share here first for a moment and then open up the other one. Okay. So the second presentation is very different from the first one, but there is a lot of relevance to this, and there are things that actually we could connect both dots together to actually derive a certain set of implications as to what will happen as the COVID settles down, or even as this virus, this pandemic drags on, but maybe to a lesser degree. These are some of the things that I think we will likely be seeing. So, so industry evolution are made up, or rather is driven by three main trends. Industry disruption, because of the fear of disruption, in this industry constantly upgrade themselves. And as industry upgrades themselves and realize that costs may not be in certain favor, some industry actually needs to migrate to another country. So I will share the presentation later on, so I will not actually go into individual explanation. Very quickly, I want to go through historical global industry migration trends. We look at this across the last two century, or sorry, the last one and a half century. So what happens is we look at this from a perspective of migrating industry, migrating directions, and key migration drivers. So I think since the start of the Industrial Revolution, the steam revolution, the Ford assembly in the 1890s and 1940s, that's the era of the rise of America. We see industry from textiles, garments, steelmaking to alloys moving from UK to the US. Reason being availability of raw materials back in the US back then, lower labor costs, emerging markets, as well as large-scale migration and war. Later on, from the 1940s to 60s, we have the World War I, War II, and because of that, war rebuilding. And this period, there's a lot of textile garments, automobiles, integrated circuits moving from US to countries such as Japan, to countries such as Germany. And of course, this country being one of the worst hit also had a lot of stimulus package, a lot of revitalization program, such as the Marshall Plan that's happening. In the 1960s to 1990s, that's the era of the Asian dragons, where we see The similar industries moving again from US, from Japan to the Asian dragon as we know of them, Taiwan, economies such as Korea, economies such as China and sorry, not China, and Singapore, Hong Kong and Singapore, sorry. And what was driving some of these trends was national industrial policy. And that's something that was very, very strong in all these four economies. Taiwan, particularly in electronics. In Korea as well, we have your LGs coming out from Korea during that period. Singapore as well, and Hong Kong. And finally, 1990s, that was the period of China's awakening. That was the period where a lot of companies from all these industries moved to China. And that was following 改革开放 in the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s, entering a World Trade Organization in 2001. And of course, with that, manufacturing share of GDP in advanced economy continues to decline. And even until now, we see manufacturing share of GDP in advanced country falling from 24% to 19% in 2016, a decline of a 20% decline or average of 0.7%. And some of the countries that are most prevalent will be US. And I think that's also one of the reasons why Trump managed to get re-elected on this particular topic, reshoring or onshoring, or make America great again. And where has all this manufacturing share gone to? A lot of which has moved into Asia, which is increasing at a 1.1% rate during this entire period, 1980 to 2060. Of which China is the main beneficiary. And within manufacturing, we can also see that a lot of the shares are moving from the low end, the more laborers, less productivity industry, to the ones that are more high tech. So you can see back in 1980 in advanced economy, 15% comes from textile, wood products, paper and printing. And now it actually continued to shrink to 9%. Whereas for electronics from the high-tech industry, it has increased from 30% to 38%. And if you look at emerging economies, the situation is even more pronounced because emerging economies for non-metallic minerals, it has increased, not non-metallic, but from high-tech industries such as electrical, optical, high-tech, mechanical engineering and transport equipment, it's increased from 16% to 30%, a doubling of the share. And at the same time as the economy is growing at the same time, this is a huge gain in even all this high-tech industry. And for the lower end one, it shrunk from 18% to 13%. But I think one has to be mindful that in terms of absolute gain, it is still positive because the entire GDP of all these emerging economies has actually grown a lot. So while the share has reduced from 18% to 13%, the actual absolute value add in this industry has actually grown significantly as well. So what happens is in this particular research, what we did was we tried to identify countries that are most likely to benefit from industry migration. So some of this criteria will be market size, urban population growth, education, national savings, because higher national savings translate to lower interest rate, translating to a higher industrialization because of the investments angle. Finally, political and monetary stability. And with this, using those matrices and using an index, China would be one of the economies that are most likely to ride the next wave, regardless. I mean, they have rode the last wave for the last 20 to 30 years, but still going forward, China will still be one of these countries simply because of population, because of continued urbanization. Vietnam is the other one, Indonesia, India, Thailand. As you can see, a lot of all these countries are all very populous countries. And in the last 10 years or so, are also countries that have urbanized very quickly, with literacy rate, with education level rising very quickly. Next, US would still be one of the countries within that identified. Mexico, Malaysia, Philippines, and South Africa. And as you can see, out of these 10 countries, 7 of them are actually from Asia, and 5 of them are from Southeast Asia. So you can see the importance of Southeast Asia in this particular chart. And I think with COVID-19, given the fact that Southeast Asia has done a much better job in stemming this entire pandemic, they will also be the first few to reopen. And what we will likely be seeing is the continued offshoring of some of China's lower end, lower value added industry to some of these countries. Because from both a production point of view, supply side, the fact that these countries are very populous would mean that wage rate will be lower in this country. A lot of all these countries also have the natural resources and endowment. And finally, from a demand side, because of these countries, how populous these countries are, they also, from demand angle, are likely to be able to supply the demand that a lot of all these companies are looking for. And not just demand, because a lot of demand comes from urban needs, right? If you are staying in urban household with access to fresh water, with access to electricity, then would you need a washing machine, for example? Would you need a refrigerator? So a lot of discretionary goods actually depends on urbanization, depends on basic infrastructure build up. So what happens is we will continue to see this theme play out in Southeast Asia, because this country are urbanizing, electrification. I'm not sure how to actually pronounce the term here. But then again, when we actually look at the different the countries that will actually most likely benefit from this global migration trend by manufacturing by low VA and high VA. VA here means value add. The makeup actually changes again. So what earlier on you've seen in terms of what we mentioned, the ranking, China, Vietnam, Indonesia. When you actually look at for low-end economy, the ranking changes slightly. China would be one, India, Vietnam, Indonesia. And then when you look at high value add, US still is the #1 in this case because of the supply chain. That's one of the key reasons, but also because of policy, because of monetary as well as regulatory stability, business environment, IP protection, among others. So the list actually changes slightly. And what we did is we try to generalize all this industry into a few different types of models. So I wouldn't go into this because I think the time we have is pretty short. But I would actually send this out, and I think we actually publish all this on our LinkedIn official accounts. We also publish them on our blog as well. So continue for us. We will share some of these things. So there are different kinds of industries and different kind of models. And over here, we actually take a look at where some of these industries under different kind of models would move from. So productivity step up is likely in electronics, electrical appliances, it's in equipment largely. And this kind of industry will continue to move from China to countries such as Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia. And then you have the low end. These are demographic dividend because they are largely labor intensive. They are your needs and wants that people start to buy when they have a little bit of money and not too much. So it will move from China largely because China is currently, or in the last 20 years been in this particular sector. They will move to largely Southeast Asia and some of the more bigger or more populous country. Supply chain relocation, this depends on raw material, and hence they will likely to move from countries where there are raw materials, so Egypt, India, Indonesia, where there are abundance of their natural endowment allows them to take advantage of some of these sectors, paper, for example, food processing as well. And there are national policies, push and pull, demand upgrading, and technology. So technology, countries that will largely benefit will be, as usual, China, US, Europe. And the sequence of industry migration in the next couple of years would largely follow such a pattern. First 3 years, Southeast Asia would likely take advantage of it more, so the other. And this timeline may have been pushed back slightly because of COVID-19. Next, we quickly look at some of the trends that are affecting all this. I think earlier on, there was a question with regards to how can Singapore take advantage of all this. I guess some of the answers are in here, but at the same time, I come back to the whole thing is Singapore is a small open economy. If the whole world doesn't do well, we'll never do well. So another way of mapping to understand some of the industries and some sectors that are most likely to do well. And finally, the conclusion, and this is probably one of the most important part, is what exactly does it mean after looking at all those slides? Is that China's move up the value chain will bring opportunities both for itself and the region. Southeast Asia will definitely be a main beneficiary because of the proximity to China. Also because of the wage condition, because of the natural endowment, because of urbanization, because of industrialization. And if you actually look at some of the deals, some of the foreign direct investment that happened in the last 1.5 years because of US-China trade war, because of before COVID, a lot of industries, a lot of investments have moved from China into Vietnam, into Indonesia, into to a lesser extent Malaysia as well. Southeast Asia will be the main beneficiary. I think one of the key thing is Industry 4.0 will also result in narrow spillovers. So labor cost advantage of traditional low-cost industry will shrink. So what it means is it increasingly all this relocation because of more machinery being involved would benefit less people than it has been in the last half a century. So during the Asian Dragons period, during rise of China period, it created a lot more employment. But I think increasingly the employment spillover would be a little bit lesser. Maybe 60% to 70% on what it used to be because of machinery. But I think in terms of wage, it will be a lot bigger because of the productivity. And what we will see more is because of Internet of Things and because of all these trends, we will see more but smaller manufacturing plants with better global coordination because, I mean, the plants talk to one another better because of 5G, because of Internet of Things, because of better ERP system, CRM systems. And I think COVID-19 probably accentuated these trends as well. As we can see, supply chain disruption is one of the key trends. So I think gone are the days where every companies would put all eggs in one basket, put everything in China. Increasingly, they would choose China and probably another populous country because, for example, the wage rate will be lower. And at the same time, it allows them to supply directly to this country within the same country. Yeah, we will also see more agile production because of 3D printing, because of Internet of Things as well. So that's all for my presentation. I think some of the trends we can see previously are already in place, and some have been brought forward by COVID-19. Yeah, that's all for my presentation. And last but not least, I will share my contacts so that you guys can take a look after that. Yeah, hold on for a moment. Yep, so this is my contact, personal LinkedIn, corporate website, and we continue to publish this. So the slides that you've just seen were published end of March after we completed the survey. So to get more updated slide, please join us, follow us on LinkedIn, subscribe to our newsletter. And with that, I'd like to hand over the airtime back to Ian.
Thank you, Kok Hao. Due to time constraints, I'm just going to actually just ask you this one question.
Yeah.
Now, Kok Hao, I need you to actually look into the crystal ball right now and predict, in your opinion, what are the list of industries that are going to boom post COVID-19, and what do you think are the industries that are going to be at risk?
Okay, I think a lot of people has published something on that, so I wouldn't be the one to claim originality, but a lot of all these things are also pretty intuitive. What we're gonna see is we're gonna see an increase in digital usage in terms of cloud storage. So, and in fact, I have heard a lot of inquiries of companies trying to buy over certain data centers, or a lot of inquiries about buying over lands for data centers. So definitely online, Zoom, technologies that allow people to communicate online. E-commerce is definitely going to boom. Shopify, a lot of people are going online onto Shopify. Wix, a lot of people are creating websites. I think in Singapore, you see even hawkers. I think for people who have stayed in Singapore, yeah, it's our version of, I don't think you can get anything like that in Europe. It's more like a Sunday market or bazaar, but it's every day, right? And you get a lot of all these vendors going online to deliver their food, to sell their wares. So definitely, you see services such as Wix. In fact, Wix actually just last month they had 2 million additional new subscribers. So things like this, things like health equipment will also do pretty well, because now that people can't go out, they'll probably start exercising at home. So the new economy is definitely gonna boom. Industries that would not do well would largely be sad to say the traditional industry that use a lot of manpower, a lot of labor. But even then, I think what will happen is really we will go back to normal. But this normal will be very different from what we used to see. And a lot of industry will start automating a lot more. A lot of industry would start to look at breaking up their offices into more satellites. I think that's something that may happen, that may happen to the real estate industry. We will likely see, for example, instead of one big HQ in Singapore CBD, say TBS may be having one level in Woodlands, one level in One North, one level in Jurong. I think that's something that's increasingly going to be a trend. A lot of companies, and even then, the total floor space would also shrink drastically, as we can see. I mean, first Facebook just literally allowed employers to permanently work from home even. So I think a lot of companies are realizing, do we even need to have a physical workspace? Nonetheless, I think we still need some level of physical workspace, but the amount of days people need to go to office will definitely just be reduced. And with such, I think a lot of things are playing out at this point in time. Yeah, that's all I can say. I think my guess is as good as everyone's.
Well, with that, this
Thank you, Ian.
concludes the end of our webinar. I'd like to thank KeyHole for taking the time out to speak on this topic.
Thank you.
And thank you very much to our participants as well. And please stay safe. Have a great day ahead. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.